My name's Peter Lawrence and I'm delighted to be talking here today with Professor Marcus Duwall, the Director of the Ethics Institute at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. Marcus will be the first keynote speaker at the conference Imagining a Different Future, Overcoming Barriers to Climate Justice, to take place in Hobart just in a couple of weeks. One of the key themes of that conference is climate justice, and my first question to Marcus is, what do you understand by the term climate justice? What does it mean, or what could it mean?
Now there's a superficial answer that would just say questions of justice are nowadays not just questions about distribution of money, distribution of wealth, distribution of access to important resources, but they have to do with access to a protected, integer nature, a healthy life environment for people. And at the same time, we are facing questions of justice when it comes to the distribution of the disadvantages of modern technologies. We have polluted airs, we have polluted seas, and it would be unjust if the rich people would have just the advantages of the modern lifestyle, while the poor would have to deal with the disadvantages.
So climate change impacts particularly poorer people, does it?
Yes.
Is that part of the context?
That is part of the context. But that is only the first layer, so to speak, of the problem. There's a deeper layer, and that is that the consequences of climate change and the other ecological challenges we are facing is so severe that the entire idea what it means to have a just society changes. And these changes have to do with the fact that climate change affects future generations, have long-term effects. And this long-termism changes the entire idea of a just society. So we cannot just think on a national scale. We cannot just think about the contemporaries. We have to include future generations, and that change what it means to create and to have a just society.
You've written extensively about human dignity and human rights. Does this provide some sort of basis perhaps for an approach to justice that could gain traction, that people could rally behind in this complex context that you've set out for us?
Yeah, indeed, I think that the basic idea of human dignity is central for possible normative solutions to these questions. So human dignity means that we have to respect each other as autonomous human beings, beings that are able to live their own life. And this respect, of course, implies that we protect those means, those environmental means human beings need in order to flourish in their life. And the human rights are protecting our ability to live an autonomous life. But the contexts have, of course, fundamentally changed. When the human rights framework was developed in 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, we thought about human rights in terms of protection against atrocities. People were concerned about Auschwitz, the Second World War, Stalin. People were concerned about a totalitarian state and wanted to protect individuals against such a totalitarian state. Now, the entire context of climate change has not so much to do with strong states, but they have to do with protecting people against the side effects of modern technologies. And the particular challenge in our context is that we have to wonder to what extent we should include future generations into the protection of human rights. And that's not trivial, because in first instance you would think to have a right presupposes that there is a right holder. Yeah? To have a right means that there is someone who has a right. but it's characteristic for future generations that they are not there.
Not yet born.
They are not yet born. So how can someone has a right who is not there? On the other hand, it would be fundamentally implausible to assume that we have a normative commitment to human dignity, to respect each individual, but that this respect would finish with the death of the last person who is existing at this very moment.
So the notion of human dignity has built into it an assumption of continuing obligations,
Yes.
continuing into the future.
Yeah, it's necessarily is open to the future. And now the question is, what does that mean for the realization of the human rights framework? So in my point of view, we have to reconsider how we have framed the human rights in a way that we take the ecological challenges and the respect for future people into account, and to integrate them in the human rights framework. So that would imply that we have to reconsider the content of human rights, the institutions that are protecting human rights, that we reconsider the procedures, how the human rights protection are realized, and so on. And I think that's a fundamental challenge.
Is there a difficulty in using human rights as a building block in this area, because it could be perceived as a Western concept that then is being imposed on developing countries that might not necessarily accept this normative framework?
I'm aware of this problem. I'm doing a lot of research together with Chinese colleagues who have some kind of aversion if the term human rights shows up. Interestingly enough, this aversion is not present at the moment when you use the term human dignity, because these concepts have some roots in the Chinese tradition. Now, I will not deny that some articulations of the human rights framework were considered in a very Western way, if you want, but I'm quite skeptical about this whole dichotomy between Western and Eastern values, if you want. So I think the human rights framework we have developed and that we have to develop should be developed much more in a global cosmopolitan way, and that requires from us to wonder to what extent we have incorporated Western biases in the human rights framework. But I find it not evident whatsoever that the entire idea of human dignity is just and only a Western idea. So you find a lot of evidences that that is a very strange assumption, and perhaps we should overcome this thinking in dichotomies between East and West and stuff like that. In any case, climate change question and the normative responses to climate change are a global task, something which we will either solve together or they will not be solved.
In terms of philosophers getting engaged in these issues, I find a lot of these discourses convincing, but how do you move from these philosophical theories and discourses to actual input into policy and to action to address climate change? How do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, that's not easy, but I think there is a growing awareness that all questions of climate change are not just questions for creating new technologies. To some extent, the technologies already exist. The problem is more how to bridge the gap between bureaucrats and technocrats who are dealing with this problem and the political discourses, because climate change is often a threat for the future which do not affect people immediately, but it will affect their children. So
So that links to imagining a different future, which is one of the themes of this conference coming up. So how important is imagining different types of futures? How important is that in terms of conceptualizing this problem?
Yeah, it's crucial, and from crucial importance, I would say. So before we can say we ought to act like this or that, we should know how we can act. We should have an idea what kind of societies, what kind of social relationships, what kind of political institutions, what kind of human nature relationships are possible. And in that regard, the humanities have a lot of things to offer. Think about history. Looking to the past always means to see that there have been lifestyles, forms of economy, forms of social life which are different from our current lifestyle. Reading literature means to imagining perspectives on the world which are not our own, but to imagining them from the perspective of other people. And
so we need to go backwards to go forwards in a way. We need to look at the past to think of ways of conceiving the future.
And what we see at the moment is that there are a lot of possibilities of working with imagination, for example, with computer games. We have in Utrecht a scientist with whom I collaborate who imagine different forms of organizing cities with virtual reality. They figure out how cities who have different forms of energy supplies, different forms of transportation, how these cities would work. And I think it's important to be creative in this respect and not just work with doom scenarios and dystopias, but to figure out how a sustainable future could look like. And that is a necessary requirement for ethical and legal considerations, because only if you know how you could live, how you could act, you can answer the question how we should act.
So this is a way of avoiding some sort of deterministic approach where we just assume a very pessimistic future.
So we have to assume that there's hope, that there's hope in a future where we can live in a sustainable lifestyle. And I think that is a central element of the respect we owe to each other.
So from what you're saying, there are powerful reasons for engaging with other disciplines, not just leaving climate policy making to technicians or engineers or scientists, but broadening the input from the humanities. What about citizens out there? What about grassroots movements? What's the connection between these ideas you're talking about and getting people engaged in the community in terms of climate change?
Yeah, I think that's a great problem, and because what we see is that there are huge discourses in an academic setting, but if we see a lot of political discourses, climate change is quite low on the political agenda, and that has to do with the fact that for normal people it's difficult to relate to all these problems. So we need active citizens who are engaged in these questions, and I see a lot of collaboration between those movements which exist and all kinds of academic circles. And I think that would be important for the past, for the future, to ensure that academic discourses have much more interrelationship with citizens which are concerned, citizens which are active, and we should avoid that it's just a topic for a very high educated elite. Yeah, so ordinary people should understand to what extent climate change will affect them, will affect their life, and either we are capable of making sustainability a project which takes broader parts of society with it, to who makes a political movement out of it, or it will be very difficult.
Thank you, Marcus. It's been a delight to speak to you today, and we look forward to continuing this dialogue at the conference in a few weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.